Billy here. Where does snarkiness come from? Why are we snarky? What is snark? I gotta stop doing that. That's a bad habit. I'm gonna try to break it. Anyway, a little over 100 years ago, there wasn't hardly any such thing, not in polite society. But people reacted to it very negatively 100 years ago. My uncle told a story about my, well, it wasn't really my granddad, the guy that raised my father. He's a Dutchman. Name is Elmer Brenneman. Dad's mother died and he was shunted off to his aunt who married a Brenneman. She was a Panacook. A lot of Dutch on my dad's side. Anyway, he practiced a lot of aspects of the Amish tradition. He was born and raised in an Amish community, but he went away. He did his wilding thing. He did some gambling. He started some businesses in a non-Amish area, but he still refused to ride somebody else's horse or in somebody else's carriage, only his own. He refused to get in an automobile. He'd ride trains, but he tried not to make himself dependent on any other people or any other systems. It was just kind of an Amish thing. And he walked to town every day, a couple of miles. He'd walk into town. Uncle said he's walking to town one day, and my uncle knew him and said his name. I don't remember. He came by with his in a wagon and said, "Hey, jump in, Homer." I said, "I prefer to walk, thank you." I think I wanted to help him, I guess, and got mad because he didn't want help. So the guy said, he got snarky with him. He said, "Well, walk then, you son of a bitch." And kept on driving. That guy was standing on the boardwalk in town talking to some people, and Elmer came up behind him. He finally caught up. He got to town, and he walked calmly up behind him and grabbed him from behind by the neck and picked him up off the ground. He was a big, strong man. Picked him up where his feet were off the ground. They held him up there till he passed out, and then he just dropped him. Oh, while he was holding him up, he said, "Call me a son of a bitch! Call me a son of a bitch!" The guy couldn't breathe, much less talk. Then Elmer dropped him and walked away. They didn't like snark back then. I've got letters that Elmer and his brothers had written to each other and other people back in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. There's no snark in any of there. There's really sophisticated humor, very subtle humor, a very elegant way of writing. These weren't elites. These were just ordinary people. And you can Google some things and find, I guess you still can, letters written a long time ago, letters ordinary people wrote, and it's all generally like that. People in America are very well educated and well mannered people, and they didn't like snark. Even my dad's generation, if somebody's mouthed off or smarted off like that, they might get popped in the head. I mean, you'd get a punch. Because back then, if somebody mouthed off to you and smacked them one, yeah, you'd get a few days in jail and a $20 fine, you know. It was a lot of money back then, but still, it was less than a week's wages. Nowadays, your life is ruined if you smack somebody. You go to prison, which is horrifying, a horrible place for a couple of years, and then get on probation and have to go to therapy. There's all kinds of stuff they do to you. So violence has been eliminated. Violence is necessary. Low-level cultural violence is what kept people polite. Now there's nothing to keep them polite. And, this is the important thing, up till about 100 years ago, people were raised in a culture where the ideal was Christ and the saints. You lived in imitation of Christ and the saints. You went to church. You knew about these things. You learned about them in school. You lived in imitation of the saints and of Christ. That was see, people imitate stuff. That's how they grow. That's how they build their culture and they build their individual characters. They're in imitation of what they see. Now what do they imitate? Television. Aren't sitcoms almost entirely snark? The conversations, you look at the conversations in situation comedies for the last, how long have they had them? Situation comedies, when did those start? Back in early 60s, late 50s? Well, they're a lot politer back then, but they got worse and worse and worse, and the newer ones are just nothing but snark. The whole conversation is laugh track. You know, they're just snarking at each other, stupid, meaningless, smart-ass remarks. So that's what passes for conversation, and people imitate that. You listen to conversations around younger people in the cafes and coffee shops, and that's how they freaking talk most of the time. Even imitate the cadence. And nobody gets smacked in the mouth. And then on the internet, where you can't get smacked in the mouth, it gets really nasty. Am I snarky? Oh, sometimes, I guess, kind of. I like to think we're a little bit higher level than that. And I'm not just automatically that way to everything that's said. I weigh it and judge it. If I disagree with it, if it's stupid and on its face untrue, and yet somebody's being touted as a guru for saying it, yeah, I'll say something. I try to be elegant about it, though. It might be really, really rude, but I try to have some elegance. Well, that's a phenomenon that we have to deal with. People aren't snarky in Russia. I don't even see it in what little TV shows I saw. I was married to a woman that watched TV. I don't think they even have a situation comedy. They have comedians and then they have drama, but there didn't seem to be any of that. Snark is looked upon as extremely rude in Russian culture. It's frowned upon. I even saw a debate, I think it was on Gordon, where they had a bunch of comedians they invited over. We're going to talk about this. Is this what you're doing really good for society? So they weigh things out on talk shows and talk about whether it's good or not. They used to do that in the U.S. They quit a long time ago. I've seen some sort of program that was made for television, that was made in the early 50s, where they were debating as to whether television was really a good thing or not, and whether it should be heavily regulated because it could warp society. And, well, we should just use it for educational purposes and to advance high culture. They used to try to advance high culture in the U.S. Farmers out in the middle of nowhere would order a piano once they got prosperous enough, and they'd get music and they'd put it in their parlor, and they'd act out plays, Shakespeare and whatnot. That was how they passed their time instead of watching Seinfeld or Married with Children. What happened? Television. Anyway, Bill D, signing out.